She didn't knock on that door looking for love. She knocked on it looking for work. And she brought every single reason a man would say no. 4 children. No husband. No money. No future that didn't feel like a slow collapse. Every door before this one had closed the same way. Politely, quickly, finally. But this rancher, this quiet, sun-worn stranger standing in a doorway at the edge of nowhere, didn't flinch, didn't calculate, didn't apologize before walking away. And that terrified her more than any rejection ever had. If you've ever felt like too much for someone to love, stay with us. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, join our family, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The wagon wheel hit a frozen rut and jolted so hard that Evelyn Hart grabbed the sideboard with both hands just to stay seated. Behind her, the children scrambled against each other like loose cargo, 4 of them, ranging from 5 years old to 13, and the youngest, May, let out a sharp cry before deciding it wasn't worth the energy and went quiet again. We there yet? That was Thomas, 8 years old, relentless. I'll tell you when we're there, Evelyn said. You said that an hour ago? I meant it an hour ago, too. Eli, the oldest at 13, said nothing. He sat at the back of the wagon with his boots dangling over the edge, watching the flat winter landscape roll away behind them like he was memorizing an escape route. He'd been doing that, watching exits, for the past 2 years. Evelyn noticed but didn't push. Some wounds needed air before they needed words. The land out here was brutal and beautiful in the same breath. Colorado territory in December had a way of stripping everything down to its bones. Gray sky pressing low over white fields, tree lines black and bare. The occasional hawk hanging motionless against the cold like something suspended in amber. Evelyn had made this drive twice before. Once to drop off a letter, and once to retrieve it when the man she'd written to never answered. But this time she was driving all the way to the gate. Greystone Ranch. She'd heard about it in Mill Haven, the small town 15 miles back where she'd spent their last coins on 2 days at a boarding house while she asked around for work. A widow named Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned it over the communal supper table, somewhat reluctantly, like she was handing Evelyn a knife that might cut both ways. There's a rancher about 12 miles out the North Road, Caleb Ashford, lost his wife 4, maybe 5 years back. Runs the place alone with a couple hands. Big house, too big for one man. She'd paused, looking at Evelyn's children the way people looked at them. The quick count, the mental arithmetic, the slight tightening around the eyes. I don't know if he's looking for help. He keeps to himself. Does he have a reputation for being cruel? Evelyn had asked, because that was the question that mattered. Mrs. Pruitt had seemed surprised by it. No, just solitary. Solitary was fine. Solitary she could work with. She wasn't looking for warmth. She was looking for a wage and a roof before the real cold hit. The ranch came into view slowly, the way distant things do on flat land. First just a dark shape, then roof lines, then a barn, then fencing, then the long, low sprawl of a house built like someone had intended to fill it and never quite stopped adding rooms. Smoke was coming from 2 of the chimneys. That meant heat. That meant someone was home and the place wasn't abandoned. Small mercies. Evelyn pulled the horse to a stop at the gate, set the brake, and sat for a moment looking at the front of the house. Mama? That was Clara, 10 years old, her second child. Quiet girl. Watchful. She had her father's eyes and her mother's talent for reading a room. Give me a moment, Evelyn said. She gave herself exactly that. 1 moment to breathe, 1 moment to remind herself that the worst he could say was no, and no was a word she already knew how to survive. Then she climbed down from the wagon, shook the cold out of her skirt, and walked to the front door. She knocked 3 times. Solid. Not timid. She heard boots on wood floor. A pause. Probably someone looking through a window or a crack in the door frame, taking stock of the wagon full of children sitting at his gate in the middle of December. She didn't blame him. She'd want to look too. The door opened. Caleb Ashford was taller than she'd imagined from the description. Not imposing, he didn't have that deliberately large quality some men cultivated to make a point, but solidly built, like someone who worked hard and ate enough to keep working. He was in his mid-30s, she guessed, with dark brown hair going gray at the temples, A beard that had probably started as laziness and become a habit, and eyes the color of creek water in November. Light brown, clear, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. He looked at her. Then he looked at the wagon. He didn't say anything. He was doing the count. She could see it. She'd learned to recognize it. That slight stillness that came over a person's face while they were running numbers. 4 children, 1 woman, a horse that had seen better seasons, and a wagon with a cracked sideboard. "Mr. Ashford?" she said. "That's right." "My name is Evelyn Hart. I was told in Mill Haven that you might be in need of household help." She kept her voice flat, professional. "I cook, clean, keep accounts if needed, can manage a garden come spring. I work hard and I don't complain." He was still looking at the wagon. She knew what came next. It always came next. So she said it herself because she'd learned that saying it first took some of the sting out of being told. "I have 4 children," she said. "Eli, 13, Clara, 10, Thomas, 8, May, 5. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't ask you to take that on as a surprise later. They're part of the arrangement or there is no arrangement." Silence. Wind moved across the porch boards between them. Caleb Ashford looked at her for a long moment, not unkind, not measuring the way a man measures a livestock purchase, but something more careful than that, like he was listening to something she hadn't said yet. "They eat a lot?" he finally asked. She blinked. That was not the question she'd expected. "Thomas eats more than a reasonable person should. The others are manageable." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Come in out of the cold," he said. "All of you." The kitchen was warm. That was the first thing Evelyn registered. Actual warmth. Not the smothered fire warmth of a boarding house where the heat was rationed, but the deep settled heat of a room with a big stove that had been fed properly all day. May pressed herself immediately against Evelyn's leg, the way she always did in unfamiliar places, her small fingers twisting into the fabric of her mother's skirt. Clara stood near the door, looking at the kitchen with the focused attention of someone cataloging details. Thomas immediately started moving in slow circles, investigating cabinet height and counter depth the way only a boy with no still settings could. Eli stood slightly apart from all of them, closer to the exit, hands in his coat pockets. Caleb set a pot of coffee on the stove without being asked. He pulled out chairs, enough chairs, and set cups on the table and a separate cup of warmed cider for the youngest without commentary. Evelyn noted that he did it naturally, without making a production of the gesture which told her it wasn't a performance. "You're from?" he asked, sitting across from her. "Originally Missouri," she said. "We've been moving west in stages for the past 2 years." "Since your husband passed?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate, he didn't push. "You've kept house before? Professionally, I mean, not just your own." "Twice. Once in Kansas for a ranch family. 3 seasons. Before that, briefly in St. Joseph for a merchant's household." She wrapped her hands around the cup. The heat went through her palms and she realized how cold she'd been, how thoroughly the cold had soaked in without her noticing. "I have letters of reference from both, if you want them." "I believe you," he said. She looked up. "I didn't say that to be easy," he said. "You drove 12 miles in December weather to knock on a stranger's door. That's not the behavior of someone trying to get away with something." May, apparently deciding the kitchen was safe, let go of Evelyn's skirt and went to stand directly beside Caleb's chair. She looked up at him with the unselfconscious directness of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned that staring at strangers was considered rude. "You have a cat?" she asked. He looked down at her. "I had one. She passed last spring." May considered this with great seriousness. "That's sad." "It was," he agreed. "We don't have a cat either," she said. "We don't have much of anything." "May," Evelyn said quietly. "It's true, though," May said, not defensively, just factually, with the unshakable logic of the very young. Caleb looked at Evelyn over the child's head. There was something in his expression she couldn't name, not pity, which she would have recognized and bristled at. Something older than pity, something with more weight to it. "The house is large," he said to Evelyn, back to business. I've been running it with rotating help from town, but that's not reliable in winter. There's a bedroom wing on the east side that hasn't been used in years. It would need airing out, but it's structurally sound. Enough rooms for the children to have some separation. He paused. I'd offer a wage and board. The work would be full-time while the weather holds, then we'd renegotiate in spring based on how it goes. She waited. The real condition always came after how it goes. That's all, he said. She stopped herself, started again. You haven't asked about their father. You haven't asked about my wife, he said simply. That landed somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. She looked down at her coffee. Across the table, Thomas had somehow obtained a biscuit from somewhere and was eating it with the complete moral certainty of a child who believed all food in arm's reach was communal property. Claire had quietly produced a small pencil from her coat pocket and was sketching something on the edge of her sleeve. Eli was still standing, still watching. I want to be clear, Evelyn said, that I am not looking for... She stopped, restarted. This would be a professional arrangement. I understand that, Caleb said. People in town may interpret it otherwise. People in town have a lot of time on their hands, he said. That's their concern, not mine. She looked at him directly then, the way she'd learned to look at men when she needed to read the truth of them. He held it steadily, without performance. His hands were around his own cup, large hands, calloused, a thin white scar running across the back of the right one. Why? She asked. Why what? Why say yes? Most men take one look at the wagon and find a reason. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the kitchen window, rattling it softly in its frame. I built this house for more than one person, he said, finally. That's all I'll say about it for now. What? The east wing was exactly as described. Sound bones, neglected surface. Evelyn spent the first hour while Caleb showed the children the barn. Thomas leading May, Clara trailing at her own pace, Eli standing in the yard pretending he wasn't watching, stripping the beds, beating the mattresses over the porch rail, checking corners for mice. The room smelled like close time, like a chapter that had been stopped mid-sentence. There were 4 bedrooms in the wing. 4. As if the house had been built knowing. She stood in the doorway of the smallest room, the one that would be May's, and let herself feel for a moment what she usually didn't permit, the fragile, unwanted flutter of something that might, if she wasn't careful, become hope. She pressed it back down immediately. She'd hoped before. She'd walked through a door before thinking this might be different, and watched it become exactly the same. She knew the pattern. Initial kindness, then gradual realization, then the apology that was really an accusation. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. As if her children were a fine print clause she'd hidden in a contract. She was not going to hope. She was going to make the beds, assess the kitchen inventory, start a list of what needed ordering before the roads got bad, and do the job she'd been hired to do. Outside, she heard May laugh, her high, ringing, uncontrollable laugh, the one that had never learned to be quiet, and then lower, slower, the unmistakable sound of a man's voice saying something she couldn't make out from this distance. She did not go to the window. She went to find more linens. Dinner that first night was whatever Evelyn could construct from what was in the pantry, which turned out to be more than she'd expected. Dried beans, salt pork, a sack of potatoes that needed using, flour in good condition, and 3 jars of preserved tomatoes that someone, probably a woman, had put up years ago and never opened. She made a thick stew and cornbread, and she fed the children first at one end of the long dining table and let them eat in the noisy, overlapping way children eat when the rule is don't cause problems rather than be perfect, which she'd learned years ago produced better-mannered children in the long run. Caleb came in from the barn with snow on his boots and stopped in the kitchen doorway. The table was full, noisy. May was explaining something at length to no one in particular. Thomas had already knocked over his water cup and was mopping it up with his sleeve. Clara was eating with one hand and drawing with the other, her sketchbook propped against the breadbasket. Even Eli had pulled his chair slightly closer to the table than he usually did, which was, for Eli, the equivalent of a celebration. Caleb stood there for a moment too long. "You want to eat at the table or in the kitchen?" Evelyn asked without turning from the stove. A pause. "Table's fine," he said. He sat at the far end. He ate without speaking much, answering when Thomas asked him questions about the horses and the barn and whether the weather was going to get worse. It was, he said, probably by end of week. And Evelyn watched from the corner of her eye the way he listened to the children. Not with the performance of a man tolerating them, with something quieter, something that looked dangerously like relief. She filled her own plate last and sat at the opposite end from him, between May and Clara, and ate. The stew was good. The cornbread was better. Outside, the wind was picking up. Inside, for the first time in 2 years, the cold didn't follow them through the door. Evelyn noticed it, filed it away, refused to name it. But she noticed. The first week at Greystone Ranch was the kind of uncomfortable that had nothing to do with anyone being unkind. It was the discomfort of unfamiliar rhythms trying to find each other, the sound of children in a house that had been silent for years, the smell of a full kitchen replacing the spare, functional cooking of a man who ate to work rather than for any pleasure in it, the small, daily negotiations of shared space between people who were still strangers pretending, carefully, not to be. Caleb rose before dawn. Evelyn discovered this on the second morning when she came downstairs in the gray pre-light to start the stove and found the kitchen already warm, coffee already made, and the back door showing a fresh set of boot prints leading out toward the barn through the thin snow. He hadn't done it for her. She understood that instinctively. He'd simply always done it, the routine of a man who'd been alone long enough that his habits had calcified into something close to ceremony. She poured herself a cup from his pot and started breakfast without comment, and when he came in an hour later, stomping ice off his boots, he looked at the spread on the table, eggs, salt pork, biscuits, a pot of oatmeal for the children, and didn't say anything except to sit down and eat. It was, she decided, a reasonable beginning. The children adjusted at their own speeds, which is to say Thomas adjusted immediately and enthusiastically. May adjusted within 48 hours once she determined the barn contained 2 horses who didn't mind being stared at. Clara adjusted quietly and privately in ways Evelyn only noticed in retrospect. And Eli did not adjust at all, at least not in any way that showed on the surface. Thomas became Caleb's shadow within the first 3 days. Not in an attached way. Thomas was not an attached child. He was a movement-seeking child who transferred allegiance freely to whoever represented the most interesting activity at any given moment. And Caleb, who spent his days doing things, fixing fence line, breaking ice on the water troughs, checking on the cattle that wintered in the south pasture, repairing the leak in the barn roof that had been bothering him since October, was to Thomas a walking invitation. "Can I help?" Thomas asked him on the third morning, appearing at the barn door in his coat and boots, while Caleb was checking a horse's left front hoof for a stone he'd noticed the day before. Caleb looked at him. "You know anything about horses?" "No." "You know anything about barn work?" "No." "Then you can watch," Caleb said, "and ask questions when I'm not in the middle of something, and don't startle her." He nodded at the horse, a dark bay mare named Rosie, who was tolerant but not sentimental. Thomas nodded with the grave sincerity of someone accepting terms of a treaty, and he watched and he asked questions only during natural pauses, which, for Thomas, represented a level of restraint that Evelyn would not have believed possible if she hadn't seen the evidence herself at supper that evening, when he described, in complete technical detail, exactly how you identified whether a horse had a stone bruise versus a deeper hoof issue. "He's patient with him," Claire said to Evelyn that night while they were washing up, her voice carrying the neutral observational tone she always used when she was actually making a larger point. "He is," Evelyn agreed. Clara looked at her and didn't say anything else. But she went back to her sketchbook with something slightly less tight around her eyes than usual. May's approach was entirely different, and entirely May. She didn't work up to anything. She simply decided, at some point on day 2, that Caleb was interesting, and that the most direct way to understand something interesting was to follow it and ask about it. Evelyn caught her trailing him across the yard on a Wednesday afternoon, her small boots punching through the top crust of snow with every step while he broke a path ahead of her, and she was talking, steadily, continuously, The way May always talked, a running narration of whatever was crossing her mind. And Thomas says the brown horse is nicer, but I think they're both the same, she was saying. Do horses have feelings? Mama says animals have feelings, but I don't know if she means feelings like I have feelings or different feelings. Do you think they're different? Caleb glanced down at her. Probably different, but real. How do you know? Because Rosie's been sulking since I moved her hay rack to the other side of the stall. She turns away when I come in to prove a point. May absorbed this. That's exactly what I do, she said. I figured, he said. She reached up and took hold of two of his fingers, the way small children grab onto the nearest available hand without asking whether it's wanted, and she walked the rest of the way to the water trough holding on. He didn't pull away. He didn't make a thing of it. He just kept walking. Her small hand wrapped around his two fingers and broke the ice on the trough with the butt end of a hatchet, like it was perfectly ordinary. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window and made herself look away. Clara's shift was the quietest and in some ways the one that meant the most. She was a child who had learned early to want things privately so that the wanting couldn't be taken from her if they didn't come to pass. She drew constantly, had since she was 6, filling the margins of whatever paper she could find with horses and trees and faces and the detailed mechanical drawings of things like stove grates and wheel spokes that made her mother secretly wonder what kind of mind was in there. In their previous life, in their previous moves, there had never been space or money to give the talent much air. She'd been in the house 4 days when she found the bookshelf. It was in a small room off the main hallway that Evelyn had registered as a sitting room of some kind. She'd been meaning to dust it, but hadn't gotten there yet. And it held not just books, but a flat wooden box on the bottom shelf that Clara opened, kneeling on the floor with the focused intensity of someone disarming something, and found inside a set of drawing pencils still in their paper wrapping, never used, a flat block of pressed charcoal, 3 pads of proper sketching paper, the real kind, thick and smooth. She didn't touch them. She closed the box and went to find Caleb. He was in the barn. She stood in the doorway until he noticed her. There's a box of drawing things in the sitting room, she said. Pencils and paper. I know, he said. Whose were they? He was quiet for a moment, adjusting something on a harness. My wife's. She liked to draw. Clara stood very still. I'm sorry, she said, because she had good instincts about when sorry was the right word. It was a long time ago, he said. Then, you draw? Yes. Are you any good? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. I think so. Thomas says I'm only okay, but Thomas thinks everything he can't do is only okay. Caleb almost smiled. She caught the edge of it. The pencils are just sitting there, he said. Paper too. Be ashamed to leave them. She looked at him for a long moment, the way her mother sometimes looked at him, that direct reading look that seemed to be running calculations he couldn't see. Then she said, Thank you, and left the barn. 2 hours later, when Evelyn went looking for her, she found Clara cross-legged on the sitting room floor, the box open beside her, drawing the window frame with a focus so complete she didn't hear her mother come in. Evelyn looked at the drawing. It was good. It was more than good. It had the particular life in it that came from someone who saw the actual shape of things rather than the symbol of them. She stood in the doorway looking at her daughter and felt the complicated ache of a parent who recognizes in their child something that never had a fair chance. She went back to the kitchen without disturbing her. Eli was the problem. Not in the way a rebellious child is a problem. He wasn't defiant, wasn't cruel, wasn't destructive. He was worse. He was careful. He moved through the ranch house like a diplomat in hostile territory, perfectly correct in behavior, perfectly contained in expression, doing his chores without being asked twice and speaking when spoken to, and never, under any circumstances, letting his guard slip below the thing he'd built around himself somewhere in the last 2 years. He was 13 years old, and he moved like a man who'd already been disappointed by the world and had decided to get ahead of it. Caleb didn't push him. Evelyn noticed that too. He didn't make the mistake that well-meaning adults often made with Eli. The over-friendly approach, the forced inclusion, the cheerful assumption that if you just tried hard enough, the boy would crack open and let you in. Caleb treated him like a person, which meant giving him room and addressing him directly when necessary and not making his distance a project to fix. What he did do was this. About 10 days in, when Evelyn had sent Eli to the barn to tell Caleb that supper was in 20 minutes, she heard afterward, from Thomas, who heard everything, that Caleb had handed Eli a hammer and asked him to hold the fencing staple in place while he drove it, because it was a two-person job and he was the only person around. Just that. A two-person job. An acknowledgement that another person's presence had made something possible. Thomas said Eli held 3 more staples after that, without being asked, and didn't say much but didn't leave either. It was not a breakthrough. Evelyn had stopped expecting breakthroughs where Eli was concerned. It was simply a hairline crack in something very solid, and she filed it away with the other small things she was accumulating and refusing to name. The work itself was harder than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be hard. The house was large, the way abandoned things become large, not just in square footage, but in the weight of accumulated neglect. She worked through it systematically, the way she did everything, starting with the rooms they were using and moving outward. Kitchen, dining room, main hallway, bedrooms. Then the sitting room once Clara had claimed it as her territory. Then the long front room with its cold fireplace and its furniture draped in canvas covers, pieces that turned out, when uncovered, to be well made and solid, just dusty and stiff from disuse. She found things in the house the way you find things in any house that belong to someone else's life. A woman's boot behind a chest of drawers, a child's mitten, tiny, soft, faded red, tucked into the back of a kitchen drawer with some string and a broken button. A row of small marks on the inside of a pantry door frame that might have been the beginning of a height chart stopped at one measurement, never continued. She didn't mention these to Caleb. She moved them carefully to a box she left on the shelf in his bedroom, where he would see them without her making a ceremony of it. The 3rd week, it snowed properly for the first time. Not the dusting they'd had before, but a real early winter snow that settled in overnight and left the ranch buried to the second fence rail by morning. It knocked out the road to Millhaven and made the daily rhythms contract inward, the way a household does in bad weather. Everything closer, everything louder, the space between people shrinking whether they wanted it to or not. Thomas took to this with enthusiasm that wore thin by day 2. He ran outside until he was soaked through, came back in, dried off, ran back out. Caleb set him to shoveling a path between the house and the barn, which occupied him for 3 hours and produced what Thomas considered the greatest physical achievement of his life to date. May developed a theory that snow was a living thing that was sleeping and spent 40 minutes explaining this to Caleb over breakfast while he drank his coffee with the patient expression of a man who had stopped trying to redirect a 5-year-old and was simply letting the river run. "She talks a lot," Caleb said to Evelyn, after May had been redirected to the sitting room to practice her letters. "She's been like that since she could form words," Evelyn said, scrubbing a pot. "The doctor said it was normal. The previous doctor said it was abnormal. I decided to stop asking doctors." "It doesn't bother me," he said. "Just an observation." "She can tell you've stopped fighting it," Evelyn said. "That's why she likes you. She always knows who's still trying to dam the river." He was quiet a moment. Then, "Smart kid." "Don't tell Thomas I said this, but she might be the smartest one." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Not a full laugh, just a short, genuine sound, surprised out of him. And it was such an unexpected thing in that kitchen that she almost stopped scrubbing the pot to look at him. She didn't. But she noticed. There was a night in the 3rd week when Evelyn couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She'd been a poor sleeper since James died, her mind refusing to fully stop even when her body was exhausted, turning over lists and contingencies and small worries the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. She went downstairs at some point past midnight and found the kitchen empty, made herself a cup of weak tea, and sat at the table in the near dark with just the glow from the stove grate. She was thinking about money. She was always thinking about money. The wage Caleb paid was fair, more than fair, genuinely. But the arithmetic of 4 children never fully balanced, no matter how carefully she managed it. Boots were wearing through. Thomas had grown 2 inches since summer, and his coat was straining at the shoulders. Clara needed more paper if she was going to keep drawing. These were not emergencies, but they were the constant background noise of her financial life, the low hum that never went fully quiet. She heard the back door and looked up. Caleb came in, stopping short when he saw her. He'd clearly been out to check on something. His coat was on, his boots wet. "Sorry," he said. "Wanted to check on the cattle. One of them was off earlier." "It's your house," she said. "You don't have to apologize for moving through it." He poured himself coffee, looked at the cold pot, and made a face. He poured it anyway and sat down at the other end of the table, which put several feet of dark wood between them. The quiet was different at this hour. Daytime quiet at the ranch had texture, wind and animal sounds and the distant noise of work. Night quiet was something else, thicker, more honest. "She okay?" Evelyn asked. "The cow." "Think so. First-time mother, nervous about the weather. She was just unsettled." "I know the feeling," Evelyn said, and then regretted it immediately, because it was the kind of thing she said to herself but not to other people. He looked at her across the table. "You sleeping all right?" "Not particularly. I never do." "Me either," he said. Another silence. A log shifted in the stove and threw a brief flicker of orange light through the grate. "Caleb," she said. She'd been calling him by his first name for about a week now, at his request. It still sat slightly awkward in her mouth, like a shoe that needed more breaking in. "Why's this house so large?" She felt him go still, not defensively, just the pause of someone deciding how much to say. "I built it in pieces," he said finally. "Added rooms over time, when I thought we'd need them. We. Margaret. My wife." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "She grew up in a house with a lot of brothers and sisters. Loved the noise of it. We always said we wanted—" He stopped, started again in a different direction. "It just ended up big." Evelyn looked at the ceiling. The house creaked in the wind the way old houses do, a complaint and a comfort at the same time. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. These were the things they had in common that neither of them had chosen. Absence, grief, the particular weariness of having loved someone and had them taken. They sat with it for a moment the way you sit with a thing that's too heavy to carry somewhere else. "The children are settling," he said eventually, changing the ground but not the depth. "Most of them," she said. "Eli'll come around." "You don't know that." "No," he agreed, "but I've got time to be patient." She looked at him then, directly, the way she had the very first day in the kitchen. The lamp on the counter threw his face half in shadow and half in amber, and he looked, she thought, less like a man and more like a piece of the house itself, something built to last, worn by weather, still standing. "Why are you patient?" she asked. "With all of it. With us. Most people aren't." He considered this for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I remember what it felt like when this house was supposed to be full," he said at last. "And it wasn't. Every room quiet, every chair empty. You get used to it the way you get used to a bad knee. You learn to walk around it, you stop thinking about it every minute, but you don't forget what walking without it felt like." He looked at his cup. "Right now the house isn't quiet. That's all." Evelyn didn't say anything. After a moment she stood up, rinsed her cup, and said goodnight. She went upstairs and lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and made herself, very firmly, not think about what he'd said. She made herself think about the list of things to order before the roads closed. Salt, thread, a new pot handle, Thomas's coat. She was not going to think about the look on his face when he said, "Right now the house isn't quiet." She wasn't going to let herself. It was another 3 weeks before the first real crack appeared. Not in Eli, not yet, but in Evelyn herself. In a moment she did not intend and could not take back. It was a Saturday. Caleb had come in from the south pasture looking gray and exhausted, walking with a slight hitch that told her his back was giving him trouble. She'd noticed it before, the way he moved at the end of hard days, stiffer on the left side. She'd said nothing about it because he hadn't offered it, and she was practicing still the discipline of not overstepping. But that afternoon he came in and sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands for just a moment. Just one moment of a man's body telling him it had given everything it had. Evelyn was at the counter. She turned, saw it, and before she could stop herself, she crossed the kitchen, opened the upper cabinet, took down the jar of liniment she'd put up last week from the supply run, set it on the table, and said, "Left side of your back, below the shoulder blade. He looked up. "You compensate right when it flares," she said, matter of fact. "It's noticeable." He looked at the jar, then at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read and didn't try to. "Thank you," he said. "It's not a kindness," she said, turning back to the counter. "You can't work if you can't move. That affects the whole household." It was a logical explanation, a practical framing. She believed some of it. She kept her back to him until she heard him stand and go upstairs, and then she gripped the counter edge with both hands and told herself to stop. Stop noticing. Stop cataloging. Stop letting small moments collect weight. She had 4 children to raise and a job to keep, and exactly no room in her life for whatever this was becoming. Outside, the wind drove hard against the kitchen window. The stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs, May was singing tunelessly to herself, a song she'd half invented, the words making no particular sense. Evelyn let go of the counter. She started on supper. December hardened into something mean. It wasn't the kind of cold that arrived gradually, giving a household time to prepare and adjust. It came down from the north in the second week of December like a door slamming shut, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in a single afternoon, turning the mud between the barn and the house to iron, sheeting the water troughs overnight with ice so thick that Caleb had to use the back of an axe head rather than the hatchet to break through it each morning. The sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way, pressing low over the ranch like a lid, and the wind that came with it had a quality to it, a persistence, a direction, that told anyone who'd spent winters on the frontier that this was not a temporary condition. Caleb said nothing about it beyond practical observation, which was his way, but Evelyn watched him quietly double the hay stores in the barn and stack extra wood against the south wall of the house and check the window sills in the east wing without being asked, and she understood from all of it that they were settling in for something serious. The children felt the shift. Thomas's roaming contracted inward, the cold being one of the few forces on Earth capable of limiting his range. May started sleeping with her extra blanket pulled over her head, a habit she'd had in bad winters past, that Evelyn recognized with the particular fatigue of a parent who has memorized all her children's fear responses. Clara drew more, if that was possible, producing page after page of detailed winter scenes, the bare tree line, the frozen water trough, the barn in half dark, studies in gray and white that were technically accomplished in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache with a feeling she couldn't fully name. And Eli got quieter. This was the thing that worried her. With Eli, quiet was not peace. Quiet was where he went when something was running underneath that he hadn't found words for yet, or had found words for and decided not to use. She knew his silences the way a person knows the sounds their own house makes at night, each one with its own specific weight. The quiet he'd been carrying through December was heavier than his usual kind. It had a pressure behind it that she felt but couldn't locate. She tried once, carefully, on a Thursday evening when the younger 3 were in bed, and she found him sitting at the kitchen table with his boots on, which meant he'd been outside recently and hadn't fully come back yet in his head. "You want some tea?" she asked, because with Eli, a direct question was a door that closed. The only way in was to offer something first. "I'm fine," he said. She made tea anyway, set a cup near him without making it a statement, and sat down across the table with her own. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at her cup. "How's the fence repair going?" she asked. Caleb had put Eli on helping with the east fence line that week, which had surprised her. It was cold, difficult work, the kind usually reserved for adult ranch hands. But Eli had said yes without hesitation, and she'd understood. He needed to be doing something that meant something. He needed to feel like he was paying his share. "Almost done," he said. 2 more posts. "Mr. Ashford says you're good at it." A pause. "He said that?" "Yesterday. Said you worked clean and didn't need to be told twice." Eli turned his cup slowly on the table. His hands looked like his father's hands. Large for his age, bony at the knuckles. It always startled her a little, seeing James in his face and gestures when she wasn't expecting it. "He works hard," Eli said, neutrally. "He does." Another silence, but a slightly different quality of silence. She waited. How long are we staying? He asked. She looked at him then. I don't know, she said honestly. Through winter at minimum. After that depends on a lot of things. On him. On the situation, she said. On the work. On a lot of things. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was accepting information without accepting what he felt about it. She wanted to reach across the table and put her hand over his. She didn't. He wouldn't have wanted it. You can talk to me, she said, about whatever it is. I know, he said, and then, I'm tired. I'm going to bed. He took his cup to the basin, rinsed it carefully. He'd always been careful with things that weren't his, and went upstairs without another word. She sat at the table listening to his boots on the steps and the distant creak of his bedroom door and the silence that came after, and she thought, something is happening in that boy's head, something I can't reach. She went to bed that night with the uneasy feeling of a person who can see weather coming from a long way off but has no way to calculate exactly when it will arrive. It arrived the following week. The storm that came in on a Tuesday night was the worst of the season so far. Wind that woke Evelyn at 2 a.m. by rattling the window in her room hard enough that she thought something had broken. Snow driving horizontal past the glass, the whole house groaning under the pressure of it like a ship in rough water. She lay still for a moment, listening to it, doing the mental inventory of a mother in a crisis. May in the smallest room, check. Thomas in the middle room, check. Clara in the room near the window that faced away from the wind, check. Eli. She was down the hall and pushing open his door before she'd fully decided to get up. The room was empty. Bed made. Coat gone. Her first thought was that he'd gone to check on the horses. He'd done that twice before on rough nights, a habit he'd picked up from watching Caleb, a way of being useful that didn't require anyone's permission. She pulled on her own coat over her nightgown, shoved her feet into her boots without fully lacing them, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. She checked the hook by the back door where Eli hung his things. Hook empty. She opened the back door against the force of the wind and looked out into the darkness and the driving snow and could see nothing at all beyond the faint yellow square of the barn light. Caleb always kept a low lamp burning in the barn overnight, and no movement between here and there. She stood in the doorway with the snow hitting her face and understood with a clarity that came from somewhere beneath thought that Eli was not in the barn. She turned and nearly walked into Caleb. He was already dressed. He'd heard the door, she realized, or had already been awake. She couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. Eli's gone, she said. He looked at her for 1 second. 1 second of taking in everything she'd just said. Not just the information, but what was under it, the fear she was holding flat to keep it manageable. How long? He asked. I don't know. His bed's made. Made or just not slept in? It was a sharp question, a good question, the kind of question you asked when you were already thinking 3 steps ahead. Made, she said. He made it before he left. Caleb turned and went to the coat hooks and started pulling on his heaviest gear without another word. The lined coat, the wool scarf, the work gloves with the leather palms. Evelyn grabbed his arm. It's the middle of the night, she said. It's a whiteout. I know, he said. You could get lost 20 feet from the house in this. I know that too. He pulled on his second glove. I'm going to check the barn first. He might have gone out earlier and gotten stuck there. And if he's not in the barn? He looked at her, straight, honest. Then I'll go further. Caleb, Evelyn. He said her name quietly, without impatience. I'm not asking you to come. Stay with the other children. Keep the stove up. He picked up the lantern from the shelf by the door, checked the oil, lit it. If he left on foot in this weather, he didn't get far. He's 13, not an experienced tracker. He'll have stayed near things he could see. Fence lines, the creek bed, something. He paused. Do you know why he left? She opened her mouth, closed it, shook her head, because the honest answer was, I knew something was wrong, and I didn't know what, and I should have pushed harder, and I didn't. Caleb nodded, as if she'd said it out loud and it was all right. He opened the back door into the black mouth of the storm, and she grabbed his arm one more time without planning to, just her hand closing on the sleeve of his coat. Come back, she said, both of you. He put his hand over hers briefly, his gloved hand over her bare fingers, 1 second. And then he went out into the dark and the door swung shut behind him. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for exactly 45 seconds. Then she went upstairs, checked that the three youngest were still asleep, came back down, built the fire in the stove up to its highest capacity, put the largest pot of water on to heat, found every spare blanket she could locate, and piled them by the fireplace in the front room, and then sat down at the kitchen table in her coat and her unlaced boots to wait. Waiting had its own particular quality when the stakes were high. It didn't feel like passivity. It felt like a kind of work, holding the stillness so the chaos outside had somewhere to return to, keeping the light on and the warmth running so that there was something to come back toward. She'd learned this during bad times before. She'd sat up at bedsides. She'd waited out fevers and a broken leg and the aftermath of James's accident before the final one. She knew how to wait, but this was different. This was a 13-year-old boy she'd watched build walls around his heart for 2 years, out in a blizzard in the middle of the night for reasons she could only partially guess at. And a man she was not supposed to care about the way she was starting to care about him, alone in a storm, looking for a child that wasn't even his. The not his child part was what undid her, sitting there in the kitchen with the wind screaming at the windows. Most men she'd known, decent men, not cruel ones, men who'd simply looked at the arithmetic of her life and found it didn't balance, would not have gone out into that storm. Most men would have said, "He'll come back when he's cold enough," or "We should wait until it eases," or "I don't know these children well enough to risk my life for them yet." These were not monstrous positions. They were rational. They were the positions of men who had not yet chosen. Caleb hadn't calculated it at all. He'd heard Eli's name in the storm and put on his coat. She sat with that for a long time in the empty kitchen. An hour and 40 minutes. That was how long it took. She knew because she watched the clock on the shelf the way she hadn't watched a clock since James was 2 days from the end, counting the minutes as they moved through her like something solid. Then she heard the back door. She was on her feet before it opened. Caleb came through first, bringing a wall of cold air and a scattering of snow across the floorboards. He was carrying Eli, not in his arms the way you carry a small child, but with Eli's arm thrown over his shoulders and Caleb's arm around his back, half supporting, half guiding, the way you bring someone in who can move on their own but is too cold and too exhausted to manage it without help. Eli's face was white and red in patches. His coat was ice-crusted at the collar and cuffs. He was shaking, a deep, structural shaking, the kind that comes from the body spending too long defending its core temperature. But his eyes were open, and when he looked at Evelyn across the kitchen, he was present. He was there. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both hands on his face before she could think about whether it was the right thing to do. His skin was like cold glass against her palms. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. His voice came out thin and slightly scraped. "I'm fine." "You are not fine, Eli James Hart," she said, and that was the whole of what she'd been holding for an hour and 40 minutes, coming out in his full name, which she only used when something had frightened her badly enough that the words required more weight than usual. He looked at her, and for a moment, just one moment, the diplomat's face cracked, and underneath it was just a boy who was cold and scared and, she thought, possibly relieved. She steered him to the fireplace in the front room and sat him down in front of the heat and wrapped the first blanket around him while Caleb pulled off Eli's boots and checked his feet for frostbite. Methodical, efficient, a man who knew what to look for. She brought the heated water in a basin, and Caleb showed Eli how to warm his hands gradually, not fast, because fast caused its own damage. And Eli submitted to all of it without protest, which was its own kind of signal. "Fingers tingling?" Caleb asked. "Yeah." "That's good. Means the blood's moving. Don't try to rush it." Eli looked at his hands in the basin. The shaking was starting to ease, incremental, the body beginning to believe it was safe now. The silence in the front room was different from the kitchen silence, from the bedtime silence, from any of the silences they'd accumulated at Greystone Ranch over the past weeks. It had a shape to it, a held-breath quality, like the silence after a very loud noise when you're not sure yet what it meant. Caleb sat on the floor near the fire, still in his coat, his own hands braced on his knees, and he looked at Eli for a moment the way a person looks at something they almost lost before they had it fully. "You want to tell me why you left?" he asked. Eli's jaw tightened. The walls going back up, the diplomatic face reassembling itself. Evelyn watched from the edge of the room and said nothing, because she understood instinctively, had always understood with Eli, that this particular door had to open from the inside. "I just needed air," Eli said. "It's 30 below and a whiteout," Caleb said. "That's not air. That's something else." Eli looked at the fire. "Eli," Caleb said. Not harsh, not demanding. Just his name, with enough weight behind it to be heard. "I just walked 2 miles in a blizzard and found you sitting against a fence post half frozen. You don't have to tell me everything, but you owe me something." A long pause. The fire cracked and threw light. "I heard you talking to the ranch hand," Eli said finally. "Henderson, last week. He said running a spread with a widow and 4 kids was a fool's charity and you'd regret it by spring." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Caleb didn't move. And you didn't disagree with him fast enough," Eli said. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger, just the flat delivery of someone reporting a fact they'd been sitting with for a week, turning it over, watching it calcify into certainty. "You said something about the situation being complicated, that was all, and I figured—" He stopped. "What did you figure?" "That if I left, there'd only be 3 kids," Eli said, as if this were a reasonable calculation, a simple math problem with a clean solution. "Mama and the little ones, that's more manageable. I'm the oldest, I can find work, I've done it before. I figured if I wasn't here, you'd be more likely to keep them." The words settled into the room. Evelyn pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Caleb looked at Eli for a long time. Something moved through his face. Not pity, she noted, not the soft, sad pity of a man looking at a wounded thing, but something harder than that and somehow more respectful, like he was looking at someone who had made a terrible decision from a real and serious place and deserved to have that acknowledged before it was corrected. "Henderson is a good worker and a poor philosopher," Caleb said. "I've told him the same to his face." Eli glanced up. "What I said about the situation being complicated had nothing to do with any of you being a burden," Caleb said. "It was about me. About whether what I was doing here was the right kind of help or the wrong kind. Whether I was overstepping." He paused. "You understand the difference?" "Not really," Eli said honestly. "A man who takes in a widow and her children because he feels sorry for them does her a harm," Caleb said, slow and deliberate, working through it as he said it. "Because when the sorry wears off, they're back to nothing, and they've stopped looking for something better. That's what I was thinking about, not whether I wanted you here, whether I had the right to keep you." Eli's hands were still in the basin. The shaking had stopped. "You're not extra weight," Caleb said. "You are not a charity case. You're not something I'm tolerating until spring." He leaned forward slightly. "You're 13 years old, and you've been holding your family together for 2 years on nothing but grit and stubbornness. That's not a burden. That's the kind of thing a man wants beside him." Eli was looking at him now, fully. His face stripped down to something younger than 13, something that had been in there all along under the soldier's posture and the watchful eyes. "My father used to say something like that," he said quietly, "that grit was worth more than talent." "Your father was right," Caleb said. A beat of silence. "This ranch has been missing something," Caleb said. "I built it for more than just me. I don't know yet what all of this becomes. And I'm not making promises about what it means or where it goes, because that's not a promise I have the right to make tonight. But I know what this place felt like before you came, and I know what it feels like now, and those are 2 different things." He let that sit. "You understand?" Eli looked at the fire for a long moment. His throat moved. "Yeah," he said, low. "Yeah, I think I do." He didn't say anything else. Neither did Caleb. Evelyn stayed at the edge of the room and didn't speak because there were moments when a mother's job was to witness and not to intervene, and this was one of them. She had watched her son build a fortress around himself stone by stone for 2 years, and she had not been able to get through it, and this quiet man sitting on the floor of his own front room in a snow-crusted coat had just reached through it with a handful of plain words and found something living inside. She was not going to cry. She was not. She pressed her hand harder against her mouth and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Caleb stood up finally and looked at Eli. Can you walk upstairs? Yes, Eli said. Then go. Blankets, dry clothes, sleep. We'll deal with the rest in the morning. Eli unwrapped himself from the blanket and stood, unsteady for a moment, then found his feet. He looked at his mother and his face did something complicated and unresolvable. The way teenage faces do when they're feeling more than they have language for. Sorry, Mama, he said. I know, she said. We'll talk tomorrow. He nodded and went upstairs. She waited until she heard his door, and then she sat down heavily in the nearest chair because her legs had been holding something tense for nearly 2 hours, and they were done with it. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and she didn't cry, but she came very close, the way you come close to the edge of a cliff and feel the pull of it and step back. Caleb sat down across from her. He'd finally taken off his coat. He looked tired in the bone-deep way of a man who'd spent himself entirely. But he was steady. Thank you, she said into her hands. You don't have to... Caleb. She lifted her face and looked at him. Thank you. He held her gaze. He's a good kid, he said. He just needed someone to tell him his arithmetic was wrong. She almost laughed. It came out as something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, but lived in the country between the two. Outside, the storm was still going. Wind against the glass, snow against the walls, the cold pressing at every seam and joint of the house that had been built for more people than it ever held. But inside the fire was burning, and the blankets were stacked by the hearth, and somewhere upstairs 4 children were breathing in the dark, and across from her a man sat in an armchair with ice still melting in his hair, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. She didn't let herself name what was in her chest. She wasn't ready. She probably wouldn't be ready for a while yet. But she stopped arguing with it. That was the most she could offer tonight, and for now, it would have to be enough. The morning after the storm had a particular quality to it. The way a room feels after a fever breaks, quieter than before, the air lighter, everything slightly rearranged even though nothing visible has moved. Evelyn woke before the others and went downstairs and stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee and looked out at the white. The storm had piled drifts against the fence line and buried the lower third of the barn door and left the yard sculpted into shapes that hadn't existed yesterday, new hills and valleys in a landscape that had just been flat ground. The sky had cleared overnight and was now that particular blue that only exists after a hard winter storm, deep, almost violent in its brightness, the sun hitting the snow and throwing light back upward, so the whole world seemed lit from below. She stood there and let herself feel, for a moment, the full weight of what had happened the night before. The empty bed, the storm, the hour and 40 minutes at the kitchen table, and then Caleb coming through the door with Eli leaning against him, half frozen, alive. She pressed the coffee cup against her sternum and breathed. There were things she had been refusing to look at directly for weeks, the way you don't look directly at something very bright because you know it'll leave a mark. She was done refusing. It was taking too much energy, and she was, in most areas of her life, a practical woman. She was in trouble. That was the plain truth of it. She had come to this ranch to work, to provide for her children, to maintain the kind of careful distance that kept things clean and simple. And instead, she had watched a man spend his own body heat on her children one by one, in the particular unstudied way that meant it wasn't a performance. And now she was standing in his kitchen at 5 in the morning, feeling something that she had no business feeling and no framework left for denying. The trouble was not that she felt it. The trouble was that she didn't know what he felt, and she'd been wrong before about what men felt, and the cost of being wrong here was not just her own heart. It was 4 children who were beginning to put down roots in this place, who were beginning to believe, in their various careful ways, that this was real. That was the part she couldn't afford to get wrong. She heard him on the stairs. His particular step, heavier on the right than the left, she'd memorized it weeks ago without deciding to. And then he was in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes with his hair still showing where he'd slept on it. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, going for the coffee. "Well enough," she said. "You?" "Fine." He poured his cup, looked at the window, looked at the yard. "Going to be a job clearing that." "Eli will want to help," she said. Caleb looked at her, just looked for a moment. How is he this morning? You checked on him? Still sleeping. I'll let him sleep. He nodded, turned back to the window. They stood at opposite ends of the kitchen, each with their coffee, looking at the aftermath of the storm, and the silence was different from any of the silences that had come before it. The night had changed something, shifted some weight that had been hanging over everything, and they were both standing in the difference of it without yet knowing how to talk about it. Caleb, she said. What Henderson said to you, about the widow and 4 kids being a fool's charity. She kept her voice neutral, the way she kept her voice neutral when she was about to say something that required steadiness. I need to know if any part of that lands for you, not what you told Eli. I heard that. I'm asking you directly. For myself. He turned from the window. He held his cup in both hands and he looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was fixing, fully, practically, without flinching from the problem. No, he said. That's a fast answer. It's an honest one. I've had time to know what I think about it. Caleb, I have 4 children. She said it the way she always said it, leading with it, putting it out in front of everything else, because that was the habit of years. Announce the obstacle first before someone else can use it against you. That's not a footnote. That's the whole story. Any arrangement that involves me involves them, entirely, permanently, not on a trial basis, and not until it becomes inconvenient. That is not a situation that most men want. I'm not most men, he said, not as a boast, as a simple factual correction. I know that, she said. I've known it for a while. That's what concerns me. He tilted his head slightly. That I'm not most men concerns you. That I'm starting to believe it does, she said, because if I believe it and I'm wrong, it doesn't just hurt me. You understand that. 5 people depend on me not being wrong about this. He was quiet for a moment. He set his cup down on the counter and crossed his arms, not defensively, but the way a man does when he's thinking hard and needs to hold himself still to do it properly. Tell me about your husband, he said. She blinked. That's not what I expected you to say. I know, but I'm asking. She looked at her coffee. James Hart, dead 2 years and 4 months. A good man, genuinely good, not the polished version people became in memory, but actually good in the daily difficult ways, patient with the children, honest in business, funny in the dry, quiet way of men who didn't announce their humor. She had loved him. She still missed him in the way that had become simply part of her structure, the way you miss a wall that's been removed. You keep almost leaning on it. He was a farmer, she said, not a rancher. We had 40 acres outside of Jefferson City. He was a good father. He showed up for the ordinary things and for the hard things. He showed up. She paused. He died in an accident with a wagon wheel and a spooked horse on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday afternoon, 2 years ago, April. Caleb listened without filling the space. After he died, I tried to keep the farm, she said. For 6 months I tried. But I wasn't a farmer. I was a farmer's wife, and those are different skills. I sold it to cover his debts, and I had about $40 and 4 children, and I started moving. She looked up. 3 different towns, 4 different attempts at work, 2 men who seemed promising and were polite about it. They saw the children, and they were polite, and then they were gone. She said it without bitterness. She'd processed the bitterness a long time ago, rendered it down into something harder and less destructive. I learned to say it first. The children, before my name, before my skills, before anything else. Say it first and see who stays in the doorway. And I stayed, he said. You did more than that, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that she hadn't planned, some crack in the neutral tone. And that is what I am. I am afraid of that, of what it means. Of whether it's real or whether it's a kind man's instinct toward a woman in difficult circumstances, and in 6 months it becomes something different. He was quiet long enough that the silence became uncomfortable. She was about to say something to cover it when he spoke. Margaret, he said, my wife. She was 24 when she died, carrying our first child. He said it without preamble, the way you say something you've said to yourself so many times, it's gone past sharp into simply heavy. She was 7 months along. The delivery came early and wrong, and we lost them both inside of 6 hours. He picked up his coffee. The child was a boy. We were going to name him Daniel. Evelyn said nothing. She knew from experience that nothing was sometimes the most respectful thing you could offer. I built the East Wing 2 months before she died, he said. She wanted 4 rooms. She had a plan. A room for Daniel, a room for the next one, a room for guests, a room for herself to work in because she painted and she wanted north light. He looked at the ceiling briefly. I put in the north-facing window myself. Took me a week to get the angle right. She was going to start using it after Daniel came. He stopped. You never painted over it, Evelyn said quietly. She was thinking of Clara, of the drawing pencils in the wooden box, of her daughter cross-legged on the floor of that room in the north light. No, he said. Something moved through the kitchen between them, something without a name that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite hope, but lived in the territory where those two things ran adjacent. I spent 3 years being very practical, Caleb said. Running the ranch, keeping the books, working hard enough that I was too tired to think much. And I told myself that was fine, that it was enough, that I wasn't somebody who needed more than what I had. He looked at her directly. And then you drove up to my gate in December with a broken-down wagon and 4 children, and you told me the worst of it first, before I could ask, because you'd learned to do that. And I thought... He stopped, seemed to be deciding how much of this to say. What did you think? She asked. I thought that was the saddest and the bravest thing I'd ever seen someone do, he said. And I thought the rooms in the East Wing were finally going to be for something. She looked at him. He looked back. This was the moment, she understood, when she was supposed to say something sensible, something measured, something about taking things slowly and not making assumptions and the practical complications of their situation. She had a whole vocabulary for this kind of moment. She'd built it over 2 years of protecting herself and her children from the cost of being wrong. She opened her mouth. I don't know how to do this, she said instead. I don't know how to... I've forgotten. If I ever knew. I haven't done it in 5 years, he said. So we're even. That's not the same as knowing how. No, he agreed. But it's a starting point. She set her cup down. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. The children, I know. Eli especially. I know, Caleb said again. And the thing was that he did know. He'd spent a night in a blizzard proving it. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm not asking you to decide anything this week. I'm saying, I want you to know what I'm thinking. That's all. So you're not operating on incomplete information. She almost smiled. That's a very practical way to declare yourself. I'm a practical man. You walked into a blizzard for my son. That was practical too, he said. I wanted him back. She did smile then, small and somewhat helpless, the smile of a woman who'd been holding herself very tightly for a very long time and felt something beginning against her best efforts to loosen. All right, she said. All right, meaning what? Meaning I heard you, she said, and I'm not running from it. And that is, for me, right now, that is significant. He nodded slowly. That's enough, he said. That's plenty. She picked up her cup and turned back to the stove and started on breakfast, because the children would be up soon and the world required feeding regardless of what had just shifted in the geography of the kitchen. He went to get his boots and coat to start on the drifts, and they moved around each other in the practical choreography of a shared household without speaking. And it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. Eli came down an hour later. He looked rested and younger somehow, scrubbed of the particular tightness he'd been wearing for weeks. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Caleb, who was coming back in from outside with snow on his shoulders, and there was a moment between the two of them that didn't require words and didn't get any. Then Eli said, I can help with the barn drift. After breakfast. I know you can, Caleb said. They ate together, all 6 of them, for the first time with something like ease, without the undertow of a thing unspoken pulling at the table's current. Thomas announced that the snow depth was the most impressive he'd ever personally witnessed, and suggested they measure it with a fence post, which Caleb said was a reasonable plan, and that they should do it after chores. May had discovered that if you breathed on the inside of the window glass, you could draw in the fog, and she spent breakfast producing a series of circular smudge portraits that she identified with increasing confidence as specific people and animals. Clara produced her sketchbook at the table, which Evelyn would have ordinarily discouraged, but she looked at the page and saw that Clara was drawing the table, all of them at the table, the cups and the plates, and the particular angle of the winter light through the window. And she said nothing. The days that followed had a different texture. The ice in the dynamic had broken the way river ice breaks in early thaw, not all at once, but in large shifting pieces, the current underneath becoming visible in ways it hadn't been before. Eli was the most visible change. He didn't become a different person. That wasn't how Eli worked, and she didn't want a different person. She wanted her son, grit and wariness and all. But the quality of his presence in the house shifted. He stopped positioning himself near exits. He started having opinions at the supper table. He argued with Thomas about the correct way to split firewood, which was a completely unnecessary argument given that Thomas was 8, but it was a real argument with real investment in it, and Evelyn loved it. He and Caleb did not become immediately easy with each other. What happened was quieter and more durable than ease. A working partnership. They repaired fence together in the mornings. They checked the cattle together in the late afternoon. They had conversations of the spare, functional variety. About the work at hand, about the weather, about the particular temperament of one of the younger horses that needed watching. And within those practical conversations, incrementally, they began to include other things. She overheard one of them on a Thursday afternoon, coming in from outside. She hadn't meant to listen, but the kitchen window was cracked for air, and they were on the porch. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Eli's voice. "No. Caleb's. I wanted to work with horses. Racing stock, originally. Spent 2 years in Kentucky doing it before I decided I wanted land of my own." "Why'd you stop? With the racehorses?" A pause. "Someone else's horses on someone else's land. It's different when it's yours." "Yeah," Eli said. He was quiet a moment. "My father had this. He had 40 acres. It was his grandfather's originally and then his father's. Used to say you could feel it different, walking land that had your name in it." "He was right," Caleb said. Another silence, but a comfortable one. "This land has your name in it," Eli said. Not a question, an observation. "It does," Caleb said. She moved away from the window then, because some conversations need their privacy to survive, but she carried what she'd heard like something warm, the way you carry a coal from one fire to start another. Clara's change was the most private and therefore the most telling. She kept drawing, obsessively, in every spare hour. And the drawings were getting better in the specific way that happens when talent stops being incidental and starts being fed. She showed Evelyn her work more often now, spreading pages on the kitchen table after supper. And once she showed Caleb a drawing of the south pasture that was, in Evelyn's honest opinion, extraordinary. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "The light's right," he said. "That's exactly how the afternoon light hits that ridge." Clara looked at him. "You notice light?" "Margaret taught me to," he said. "She was always pointing it out. Drove me a little crazy for a while, and then it stuck." Clara looked at the drawing. Then she looked at him with that calibrating expression she used when she was adjusting her understanding of something. "I can show you what I'm working on next, if you want." "I'd like that," he said. She nodded and took the drawing back and went to the sitting room, and Evelyn, washing up at the counter, kept her back turned so Clara wouldn't see her face doing the thing it was doing. Thomas, who was Thomas, had no subtlety about any of it. By the 3rd week of December, he had taken to calling Caleb by his first name, dropping the Mr. without comment or ceremony, and had begun greeting him in the mornings with an itemized list of things he wanted to know or do that day, delivered while Caleb was still pulling on his second boot. Caleb received these lists with the particular patience of a man who had decided this was simply the texture of mornings now, and had adjusted accordingly. May continued to hold 2 of his fingers whenever they walked anywhere together. This was simply a fact of life on the ranch now, observed by everyone and commented on by no one. The week before Christmas, Evelyn found something while sorting the linen closet on the 2nd floor. It was in a box on the top shelf underneath some folded curtains, a set of 4 stockings, hand-knitted in different colors, never used. They still had the paper wrapping around them, still tied with the ribbon from whatever store they'd come from. There was no name on them. There didn't need to be. She sat on the floor of the hallway with the stockings in her lap for a long time. Margaret had bought 4 stockings. She had planned, counted, prepared 4 stockings for the children she and Caleb had expected to have, and then there was nothing to fill them with, nothing to hang them for, and they'd ended up in a box at the back of a closet where the painful things went. Evelyn held them for a long time. Then she got up and took them downstairs and found a length of twine and hung them along the mantel in the front room. The 4 stockings, one for each of her children, and she did not move them. Caleb saw them that evening. He came in from outside and went to the front room and stood in the doorway looking at the mantel. She watched him from the hallway, not hiding, just giving him a moment. When he turned around and found her there, he didn't speak for a second. "She would have liked them," he said finally. His voice was steady. "My kids, and your kids. She would have thought that was just right." Evelyn looked at the stockings on the mantel. "Whose children would they have been?" she asked. He thought about it. "All of them," he said. "She wasn't particular that way." Something released in Evelyn's chest that she hadn't known she'd been holding. Some last residue of guilt, maybe, for feeling alive in a house where someone else's grief still lived, as if her own life was an encroachment on the memory of another woman's hopes. "I never asked you," she said, "if it bothers you, having us here, in her house." He looked at her with something direct and clear in it. "It's not her house anymore," he said. "It's mine. And right now it's ours. And if she was the kind of person I know she was, she'd want it full." Evelyn nodded. She didn't trust her voice right then. "Come on," he said. "Supper's gonna burn." She followed him to the kitchen, and they made supper together in the way they'd developed without designing it. Him at the stove, her at the counter, the children arriving in stages as the smell worked its way through the house. Thomas first at a run, May second, Clara third with charcoal on her fingers, Eli last but no longer hesitating in the doorway before sitting down. They ate with the stockings on the mantel in the next room, and the storm behind them, and the winter still ahead, and the table was loud and imperfect, and someone knocked over a glass. Thomas. Inevitably, Thomas. And May explained at length why she thought snow was sad, and Eli corrected Clara's claim about the temperature at which water froze, and Caleb ate his supper and said little and looked, when he thought no one was watching, at the faces around his table. Evelyn saw him look. She always saw. She looked away before he caught her, and she ate her supper, and she let herself feel, carefully, with both hands, like something that had been in the cold a long time and needed warming slowly, the thing she'd been refusing to name. It was not a small thing. It was not a convenient thing. It was not the kind of thing that made her life simpler or her future more certain. But it was real. She was sure of that now. And real, after everything, was the only thing that had ever been worth the risk. Spring came to Greystone Ranch the way it always comes to high country. Reluctantly, in stages, with several false starts that got everyone's hopes up and then buried them under a late March snow before finally committing in April with the particular conviction of something that had made up its mind. The first real sign was the mud. The frozen ground softened, and the yard between the house and barn turned into a serious operational problem that Thomas discovered firsthand on a Monday morning when he stepped off the porch and sank to mid-calf on his way to feed the horses. He extracted himself with some difficulty and significant loss of dignity, and May, watching from the window, laughed until she had to sit down. And it was the kind of ordinary, ridiculous household moment that Evelyn found herself holding afterward with both hands. The specific laughter of a 5-year-old, the specific expression on a boy's face when the world has embarrassed him, the specific quality of a morning at Greystone Ranch where the mud was bad and the light was new and something was coming back to life. She was standing at the kitchen window looking at the yard when Caleb came up behind her. Not close, they were still careful with proximity, still navigating the particular geography of two people who knew what they felt but had not yet put formal language around it, and looked out over her shoulder. "Mud's back," he said. "So I see. Thomas going to survive that?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally, it'll take a few days." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She could feel the warmth of him standing that close, not touching, just present, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a fire when you've been cold for a long time. Not frantically, just steadily, a fact of the room. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know," he said. She turned and looked at him. "You know? I've been waiting for you to be ready," he said, simply, without accusation. "I figured you'd tell me when you were." She had been ready for a while. That was the honest truth, the one she'd been sitting with through March and into April, turning it over, examining it from every angle the way she examined all important things, looking for the flaw, the hidden cost, the place where it would break under pressure. She hadn't found one. She'd found fear, but fear and flaw were different animals, and she'd learned, slowly and with some difficulty, to tell them apart. "I've been counting," she said. He looked at her. "Every time we moved, every door that closed, I kept a count," she said. "Not a real count, not numbers written down, but a running tally in my head of all the reasons I was wrong to hope. All the men who seemed decent and weren't, long term. All the places that seemed like they might work and didn't. After a while, the count gets heavy enough that you start leading with it instead of following it. You make it part of your introduction. I have 4 children. There it is, the number, the obstacle, the reason you're about to leave." "I remember," he said. "You didn't leave," she said. "No. And it hasn't been easy," she said, because she needed to be honest about this, needed to say it plainly rather than let it get softened by sentiment. "We are loud, and we are expensive, and Eli scared 10 years off both of us in one night, and Thomas has broken 2 things in this house that I know about, and possibly a third I haven't found yet." May talks from the moment her eyes open. Clara takes up every horizontal surface with paper and pencil, and she will not apologize for it. She paused. "We are not a simple addition to a quiet life. We are a complete reorganization of one." "I know what you are," he said. "I need to know if you've actually thought about what that means," she said. "Not in the abstract, not in the middle of a crisis when the feeling is running high. In the ordinary days. In the days when it's just this. Mud and noise and someone's boot missing and the money not quite reaching and the children being exactly who they are, which is imperfect and demanding and mine." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she had learned over these months to read. Not the quiet of a man avoiding a question, but the quiet of a man who takes questions seriously enough to give them proper weight before answering. "Last October," he said, "before you came, I ate supper alone at that table every night for 11 months straight. Not because I didn't have options. Henderson offered to have me up to his place regular. The family in town at the feed store invited me to Sunday meals 3 times. I didn't go." He looked past her at the table in question. "I told myself I was too busy. But the truth was that eating at a table alone when you built it for more than one is a specific kind of hard, and being around other people's full tables was worse." He looked back at her. "I'm not saying that to be sad about it. I'm saying that's what I know the alternative feels like. And I'm telling you that every morning since December, when I come downstairs and that table is covered with someone's school book and Thomas's muddy gloves and May's drawings and Clara's charcoal pencils, I think. This is what it was for. Not some of it. All of it. Mess and noise and the money math and Eli's face when he's deciding whether to trust me. All of it." She looked at him for a long time. "I'm 30 years old," she said. "I have 4 children, and I own practically nothing. And I have not been easy to know." "No," he agreed. "You haven't. You've been worth it." Something in her chest cracked open, quietly, like ice on a river when the temperature has been building toward it for weeks. Not a dramatic break, just the moment when the pressure finally exceeds what the cold can hold. "I don't know how to be someone's wife again," she said, and her voice was steady but only just. "I don't know if I remember." "I don't know how to be someone's husband," he said. "I remember some of it, and I've probably forgotten the important parts. So we'd be figuring it out. Together," she said. "That's generally how it works," he said. She almost laughed. The almost laugh turned into something that stung her eyes, and she looked at the ceiling for a moment to collect herself because she was not going to cry in the kitchen at 7 in the morning over a practical conversation about marriage. That was not who she was. "Ask me properly," she said when she'd collected herself. "Not right this second, but soon. Ask me the way you mean it." "I will," he said. He did. 3 days later, on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed, when the sky over the western ridge had gone, the color of banked coals, and the first frogs had started up somewhere near the creek, that particular sound, the first frog sound of the year, that meant winter was truly done. He came out to where she was standing with her coffee, and he asked her without preamble and without excessive ornamentation, in the plain direct way he did most things, and she said yes the same way, without ceremony, without performance, but meaning it entirely, all the way down. The children were told the next morning at breakfast. Evelyn had thought about the best way to approach it, and had landed on simply saying it clearly and then letting them react however they were going to react. Thomas said, immediately, "Does this mean we get to stay?" And when Evelyn said yes, permanently yes, he said, "Good," with the decisive satisfaction of someone closing a business deal, and went back to his oatmeal. Clara looked at Caleb for a long moment with her calibrating expression, and then nodded, once, slowly, as if confirming a calculation she'd already made weeks ago. May burst into tears, which frightened everyone for 3 seconds until she was able to articulate through the crying that she was crying because she was very happy, and that sometimes when she was very happy, her face didn't know the difference, which was a piece of self-knowledge so accurate that Evelyn had to look at the ceiling again. Eli didn't say anything. He sat at his end of the table and he looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked back at him, and whatever passed between them in that look was private and sufficient. Then Eli picked up his fork and finished his breakfast, and when he stood up to take his plate to the basin, he stopped next to Caleb's chair and put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder. 1 hand, 1 second, no words, and went outside to start on the morning chores. Caleb sat very still for a moment after he left. "You all right?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Fine," he said. His voice was slightly different from its usual register. "Just fine." They married in May, on a Saturday, with the apple trees Caleb had planted on the south side of the house in full flower, and the yard finally dried out, and the sky doing what it occasionally did in May on the Colorado frontier, going a blue so absolute it seemed structural, like the color was holding everything up. The ceremony was small. A traveling judge who came through Millhaven monthly, the Henderson family who showed up with a pie and had the decency to look genuinely pleased, and 2 other ranch families from within riding distance who'd been watching the situation at Greystone with neighborly interest and varying degrees of approval. Evelyn wore the best dress she owned, which was blue-gray wool and not particularly ceremonial, and she'd let Clara put flowers in her hair, small white ones from the edge of the creek, which Clara had arranged with the focused seriousness she brought to anything visual. Caleb wore his good shirt and had shaved, which Thomas commented on at length. The judge was efficient. The vows were simple, when it was done, May hugged Caleb's leg with both arms before anyone had said anything, and he put his hand on the top of her head. And that was the image Evelyn found herself returning to later. Not the ring, not the words, not even the particular look on Caleb's face when he said what he meant. May's arms around his leg, his hand on her hair. The simplest possible form of belonging. The reception, such as it was, happened at the long dining table. Caleb had extended it the week before, adding a section he'd been meaning to build since February, and with the Henderson family and the other guests, it was the first time all the chairs were occupied. The table was loud. The food was excessive because Evelyn cooked the way she did everything, thoroughly, with full commitment, and Thomas ate more than was physically advisable, and May fell asleep on the bench before the pie was served and had to be carried up to bed by Caleb, who did it without comment, the small sleeping child against his shoulder, and came back down and ate his pie standing at the counter. It wasn't perfect. A glass broke. Eli got into an argument with the Hendersons' older son about something ranch-related that got slightly too heated before the elder Henderson redirected it. Clara disappeared for 40 minutes and was found in the sitting room drawing the table from memory. From the door, the whole scene rendered in quick strokes that caught something. The angle of the light, the full chairs, the shape of a family at table, that no formal portrait could have. She showed it to Evelyn later that evening. "Can I keep it?" Evelyn asked. Clara looked at her. "I made it for you," she said, as if this were obvious. Evelyn put it in the frame that had been sitting empty on the sitting room wall since they arrived. The months that followed had the specific texture of a life being built, not assembled from a plan, but grown the way things actually grow, unevenly, with setbacks and sudden leaps, with days that were hard for no particular reason and days that were unexpectedly good. The ranch work expanded in the spring, and Eli, now 14 and serious about it, took on real responsibility that Caleb gave him without condescension and without taking it back when something went wrong. Because things went wrong. Tools were used incorrectly. A gate left open. A calculation about the South Pasture water situation that cost them 2 weeks and some money, and each time Caleb went through what happened and why, and what to do differently without turning it into a referendum on Eli's worth. One evening in July, Evelyn overheard them on the porch again. Eli's voice, then Caleb's, and she stopped on the other side of the door without meaning to. "You think I could run a spread like this someday?" Eli's voice. Careful, like he was putting something fragile down in front of someone and watching to see if they'd handle it right. "Yes," Caleb said. No pause, no hedging. "Not tomorrow, but yes. On my own or—" "Ranching's not really something you do alone," Caleb said. "Technically you can. Practically you shouldn't." A pause. "This land will need someone after me. I've been thinking about that for a while." Silence. "You'd have to want it," Caleb said. "I wouldn't ask you to take on something you didn't choose." "What if I do want it?" Eli said. "Then it's yours to work for," Caleb said. "Same as anything worth having." She moved away from the door and stood in the kitchen and put her hands flat on the counter and made herself breathe steadily, because the accumulation of moments like this one was doing something to her insides that she had no efficient way to manage. She had been a person who kept accounts, of disappointment, of risk, of all the ways things could go wrong. And something about this life, this specific ordinary July evening with her oldest son on the porch, talking about his future, was running through the ledger and canceling debts she hadn't known were still owed. The following spring, Evelyn's second spring at Greystone, her first as its co-owner, its co-keeper, the woman whose name was finally written into the deed that Caleb had quietly updated in January without making a ceremony of it, simply handing her the document and saying, "This is yours too," the way you hand someone something that was always going to be theirs. She discovered she was pregnant. She sat with it for 3 days before telling Caleb. Not because she was unsure of how he'd receive it. She knew, she was fairly certain she knew, but because she needed the 3 days herself. To sit with the particular weight of a new life when your life already held so much. To allow herself to want it without immediately tallying the complications. To stop doing the fearful arithmetic long enough to simply feel the things she felt. She told him on a Thursday evening in the kitchen, while he was reading the week's accounts, and she was ostensibly mending Thomas's coat, which had been losing buttons at a rate that suggested either a structural defect or aggressive living. She said it plainly. "I'm pregnant." He looked up from the accounts. He was very still for a moment. "How far?" he asked. 8 weeks, I think. Maybe 9. He set the accounts down. He looked at her with an expression she had learned over a year and a half to read with some accuracy. And what she read was not complication or calculation, but something raw and genuine that he was trying to hold in a form that didn't embarrass either of them. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was slightly careful. "I'm fine," she said. "Tired. Some mornings are rough, but I'm fine." "Good." He nodded, then, "Good." She looked at him. "Say what you're thinking." He picked up the accounts, set them down again. "I built the table extension in February," he said, "thinking we might need it eventually, for guests, for the holidays." He paused. "I might need to build another one." She understood what that meant. He was telling her, in the sideways manner of a man who felt things deeply and said them obliquely, that this was not a problem to be solved, that this was the table expanding again, the chairs filling, the house doing what it had always been designed to do. She went back to the coat buttons, and he went back to the accounts, and May's voice drifted down from upstairs where she was theoretically in bed and was clearly not, And Thomas's boots on the stairs were unmistakable as he went up to tell on her, and somewhere in the east wing Clara's lamp was still burning at 9 in the evening because Clara would draw until her eyes gave out if nobody told her to stop. Caleb looked up toward the ceiling where all these sounds were happening. "Clara's still up," he said. "I know." "Someone should tell her." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. Neither of them moved. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the quiet between one moment and the next, in the lamp-lit kitchen of a house that had been built for more than one and had finally become it, something passed between them that was not romantic in any decorated sense, but was more intimate than any decorated thing could be. The shared ease of two people who have chosen each other fully, difficult parts and all, and discovered that the choosing holds. The baby was born the following December. A girl, healthy, loud from the first moment, with Evelyn's coloring and a set of opinions that appeared to be her own from the start. They named her Ruth. May appointed herself primary assistant in all things Ruth-related and performed this role with an intensity that was both exhausting and genuinely useful. Clara drew her constantly. The sleeping face, the wide-awake face, the specific curve of small fingers. Thomas held her exactly once, declared her very small and very loud, and returned to more interesting concerns. Eli held her with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd never held a baby and was not going to drop this one, and he looked down at her face with an expression that Evelyn had not seen on him before, uncomplicated, unguarded, the face of someone who has not yet thought of a reason to protect himself from this particular feeling. Caleb built the table extension in January. He worked on it in the evenings after supper in the front room, fitting and sanding and fitting again, and when it was done, he extended the table on a Sunday morning and called all of them in to see. "Fit everyone?" Thomas asked. "For now," Caleb said. "Ruth will need a proper chair in a year or two. We'll figure it out." Evelyn looked at the table, at the chairs around it, at the length of it, the width, the specific, ordinary beauty of a table set for 8. She thought of the woman she'd been 18 months ago, pulling up to this gate in a December wind, organizing her introduction around her obstacles, announcing her 4 children the way a defendant announces a charge before the verdict is read. She thought of herself leading with the worst of it, preemptively, relentlessly, because that was what years of closed doors had taught her. Say it first, at least the closing comes from you. She had been so certain that love had a carrying capacity, that there was an amount of a person, an amount of need, of history, of complication, of dependence, beyond which no reasonable heart would follow. She had counted herself past that limit, had decided, somewhere in the accumulation of rejections, that she was simply too much, that the children made her impossible to love sustainably. What she had never accounted for was a man whose capacity hadn't been reduced by loss, but somehow expanded by it, whose empty rooms were not evidence of a smaller life, but of a larger one waiting, whose arithmetic ran opposite to hers. Where she counted 4 reasons to be turned away, he had been counting chairs. This was the thing she had learned at 31 years old in a ranch house on the Colorado frontier in a winter that nearly broke them. That the story you tell about yourself, the ledger you keep, the count you run, the number you lead with when you're afraid, is not the truth of you. It is only the armor. And armor is useful when the world is dangerous and you are alone. But there comes a moment, if you are lucky and if you are brave enough to recognize it, when someone asks to stand beside you and the armor stops being protection and starts being a wall, and you have to decide what you're more afraid of, being hurt or being kept. She had been wrong about the arithmetic. She had been running the numbers on the wrong equation entirely. She was not 4 reasons to be rejected. She was the reason 5 empty chairs finally had something to hold. Eli called him Pa for the first time in March, on an ordinary morning, without apparent premeditation. He came into the kitchen, said, "Pa, the fence along the north draw needs looking at," and went to get his boots. Caleb was pouring coffee, and he stopped pouring for a second, not long, and then poured the rest and said, "I'll take a look after breakfast." And that was all. Later, when the children were out and the house was briefly quiet and Evelyn found him standing in the kitchen doorway looking at nothing in particular, she knew what he was thinking about. "You heard that?" he asked when he heard her behind him. "I was right here," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Some things you can't improve by talking about them. Some things are complete exactly as they are. A boy who'd spent 2 years building walls calling a man by a name that meant, "I choose you. I let you in. You're part of the count now." Outside, the spring was properly underway at last. The mud had given way to green. The creek was running clear and fast with snowmelt. And somewhere out in the south pasture, Eli and Thomas were arguing about the fence, audible from the kitchen, the specific register of heart-family disagreement that Evelyn had long since stopped trying to prevent and simply managed for casualty levels. Ruth was sleeping in the small room that had once been empty and now smelled like talcum and warmth, and the cedar of the new cradle Caleb had built in February. Claire's drawings covered the sitting room walls, arranged by herself with the authority of someone who knows exactly where things belong. May was in the yard talking to the horses. The table waited in the dining room, extended and full, 8 chairs around it, a length of wood worn smooth at the edges where people had sat and reached and rested their elbows through the ordinary accumulation of shared meals. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of a house that had once been someone else's grief, and was now, improbably, stubbornly, completely, hers. She picked up the coffee pot and poured 2 cups and set one at Caleb's place and kept one for herself, and when he came in from the doorway and saw what she'd done, he sat down at the table without a word, and she sat across from him, and the house moved and breathed around them. Loud, complicated, entirely imperfect, and neither of them would have traded a single chair of it